Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Joe Pakootas. He's the Democratic nominee seeking election to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 5th Congressional District. Mr. Pakootas grew up in Chelan, Washington, on the Colville Reservation. For 16 years, he served as an elected leader on the Colville Tribal Council, including as chairman. He now serves as the CEO of the tribe's business enterprises. He received a master's in business administration from the University of Washington. And in 2013, the University of Washington recognized Mr. Pakootas with the William D. Bradford Minority Business of the Year Award in recognition of his role in a dramatic increase in revenue to the Colville Confederated Tribes. So without further ado, Mr. Joe Pakootas.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. It's kind of very intimidating, actually, being in this room. And I'll start off with just a little bit of a story about Tom Foley. When I was chairman of the tribe back in the late 90s, and Tom was still Speaker of the House, and we had some issues on Lake Roosevelt. And we had some houseboats on Lake Roosevelt at that point in time, and because of my business background and stuff, we don't have houseboats there anymore, no more tourism. But we'll get to that story later on. But Tom, he come down to visit us, and we had some issues, some jurisdictional issues on Lake Roosevelt. So we had Fish and Wildlife people from the state, and Fish and Wildlife people from the tribe, and tribal council, and we had other elected officials, county commissioners, and visiting us. We went for a houseboat trip on Lake Roosevelt. So we'd taken 2 houseboats, and we had about 13 people on each houseboat. One of our houseboats, one of our general counsel, one of our chief attorneys was driving one of the houseboats, and our Fish and Wildlife director was driving the other houseboat. Well, we was just kind of trailing each other up and down the river, and we were talking and discussing the issues on one of the boats with the elected officials, and all the staff people were on the other boat. So our Fish and Wildlife director was driving the boat in front, and they were watching on the sidelines for some wildlife. And we were down in one of our wildlife areas, and there's a lot of elk and deer and mountain goats down in there. So they happened to see some wildlife, some actual mountain goats that we had transplanted on the reservation that were down on shore. So they stopped, and our attorney was driving the boat that we were all on, and he did not stop. So anyway, we had a little bit of an accident, and so luckily we had the attorney driving, so we were pretty well covered legally. And Tom Foley, he was pretty excited, pretty shook up, but everything worked out just right. And we actually did work out through our jurisdictional issues, and so that little accident didn't happen to, change the minds of Congress back then. So we was able to accomplish our mission. But I want to kind of give you a little bit of a history, maybe dispel some myths and maybe a little bit of stereotypes about Indian people to start off with, so you'll understand who Joe Pakootas is. We've gone through what I consider 4 different eras in our lifetime as Native Americans, as being the first Americans, the only ones that aren't immigrants here in the United States. The first era that I want to talk about was a real troubling one, and that era was what we call annihilation. When non-Indians, white people, come to America, one of the first things that they worked on doing was annihilating the Native Americans that were here, because we did not speak English, we didn't practice some of the Western cultures and society and all that kind of stuff. So one of the things that was looked at was annihilating the Native Americans. That went on for a number of years, and that wasn't very acceptable, they found out after a while, with the additional people coming into the country. So they changed their tactic, and in the early 1800s they started looking at another era, what we call assimilation era. And that era, what they would do is they would come onto the reservations, and they would, what we said was kidnapped many of our young people. They would be 5, 6, 7 years old, and take them to boarding schools off the reservation. and cut their hair, give them English names, and not let them practice their traditions or their cultures or their language. And so that was to assimilate us into the Western society and the cultures. And that wasn't very well accepted either at that point in time, because there was a lot of people that were concerned about how things were going back then. And the Native Americans actually were really concerned about it too, because we were actually not able to practice our languages. And that's a big part of our cultures and traditions is our language. You lose your language and then basically everything else goes along with that. So that's one of the things that we were really proud of back then. My grandparents were part of that. So I don't speak our language at all. And I can only assume that they didn't teach me because of what happened to them. But we do have a lot of our young people that are learning our language today, and to retain that, to capture that, recapture that, and bring it back. So that was another era that we talked about and lived through. All of this was to basically do away with the Native Americans so that they wouldn't have the dependence upon their land, the dependence upon their cultures and their traditions. Okay, so the next era that we're going to talk about a little bit is what we call the termination era. And by this time, Indian tribes had reservations established. The federal government had established a number of Indian reservations throughout the country. Today there's about 566 registered Indian tribes in the United States and Canada. So each one of these tribes, actually, each one of these tribes has reservations of their own. But there's more tribes within those reservations than there's actually reservations. Because my reservation, my tribe is a confederation. It's Colville Confederated Tribes. There's 12 different tribes that make up our confederation. And it's almost all of eastern Washington. There's the Wenatchee, the Chelan-Eniat, the Colville tribe, the Moses Columbia, the Okanagan, even Chief Joseph Band is a member of our reservation. And the Palouse Band from down in the Tri-Cities area is a member of our reservation too. So there's 12 different tribes that make up our confederation, which is one of the 566 reservations in the United States. So we're into the termination era. And what they wanted to do was they left it up to the individual tribes to terminate themselves, because they did have governments established for each one of them by then. So they threw a carrot out to our tribe, the Colville tribe, and offered $20,000 to each enrolled member if they would consider or convince their tribal council to terminate the reservation. And that was happening back in the 50s. There was really, really close for our reservation as far as termination. And the reason for termination is if Indian tribes didn't have need for land, then they didn't have no need for reservations. And we could basically assimilate into the Western society. So that was the purpose for termination. And we were very, very close to termination. And we have 14 council members on our tribal council, which I was one of later on. And it come to a vote on our reservation. Our chairman does not vote on many of the bills or resolutions that come forward unless there's a tie. So it was rigged at that point in time. So the vote was actually 7-6 to terminate our reservation. That was in the late 50s and early 60s. And our chairman was one of the people that did not want to terminate. So he was pretty politically savvy back then. And what he did is he resigned his position as chairman. And at that point in time, the vice chairman had to step up to be the chairman. So the vice chairman was one of those people that wanted to terminate. You see how that worked out? And the vice chairman wasn't politically savvy at that point in time until the vote was actually taken and the resolution was approved by the federal government. So our reservation was saved by a vote of 7-6 back then. So it was pretty exciting times, in looking at the political side of things and how that worked out. So we were not terminated. The next era that we had to deal with was what they call relocation. Okay, they couldn't terminate. There was quite a few Indian tribes that actually did terminate. back in those years. So the next era was what we call relocation. And what the federal government would do was they would take families of Indian people off the reservation, locate them someplace in the United States, someplace in the world, train them, get them jobs, and hope that they would not want to return to the reservation. So if there was no Indians on reservations, there was no need for reservations. So, and my family was part of that. When I was 3 years old, we actually went to California. There were 7 of us in my family. There was 4 at that time, and 3 of my brothers were born down in California. And this was in the early 60s. Our family went to California. We moved to San Jose, and my dad was taught how to build boats, small boats, family boats, yachts, and that kind of stuff. So that's what he did. So they relocated us, and there was hundreds of other Indian families and people that did go on to the relocation, and some of those never did return to the reservation. But we did after 3 years. We returned back to our reservation, and many of the other Indian tribes or Indian people returned back to their reservations at that point in time. So basically there was a need for our reservation. There was a need for our lands. So those were kind of the 4 different eras that we lived through as Indian people. And there was another try at this termination era too that went on early in the 1930s, what they call the Dawes Act, or what we call the Allotment Act. And this is before termination, and it was another ploy, but it's not one of those, you have a termination, relocation, the shuns, I guess you want to call them. This was an Allotment Act where they would actually allot Indian families a portion of land, depending on the size of their family. They could get up to 160 acres. That was allotted to them that they could have and live off of within that reservation. The federal government did this. So a number of our tribal members actually did have allotments. My grandparents still, they're both passed away, but they had allotments over in the Wenatchee area where our original reservation was. So with those allotments, what they would do is the tribal members could live off of that land, and I can't remember the amount of acres. Our reservation back then was about 3 million acres. Now it's about 1.5 million acres, so we're about half the size that it originally was. That Ulysses, President Grant had by executive order granted the Colville tribes. So they opened up for allotment, and what wasn't taken through the Allotment Act, they opened up for homestead. And there was hundreds of thousands of acres that was taken for homestead back then. So that was another form of doing away with Indian reservations. That our reservation was 3 million acres, and they had taken 1.5 million because on our north half there was gold and silver and a lot of minerals found. And we weren't miners, so we didn't have no use for that. So they'd ceded half of our reservation. Well, during the Allotment Act, when a lot of our tribal members had received those allotments, and one thing that they weren't told during that time is if they wanted to live off their land, if they wanted to farm it, if they wanted to log it, get revenues from living off their land, it became taxable at that time. So many of our tribal members lost their lands to tax sale. And these big timber companies, Boise Cascade, come in and they bought 36,000 acres of our reservation in tax sales. So there was a lot of our tribal members that lost their lands during that period in time to tax sales because nobody knew that they had to pay taxes. Well, there was a number of acres lost then, and then the Homestead Act also we had lost a lot of acres too. And this was back in the late 40s and early 50s when a lot of the homestead properties were being taken too, and what wasn't taken either through allotment or through homestead reverted to the local counties, which we have Ferry County and Okanagan County, that is where our reservation is. So those lands reverted to the county, put on their tax rolls. So we lost hundreds of thousands of acres of the 1.5 million acres that we were actually granted from the president back in 1872. So during that time, there was a big fight to recover some of those lands, And in order for us to recover the lands that weren't taken in homestead or allotment that were with the county, we had to pay property taxes to the local county to the tune of about $800,000 to get our 800,000 acres back to control of the tribes. So those are some real exciting times, and we really become politically savvy back then as far as governments and protecting our cultures, our traditions, protecting our lands, protecting our reservations. So it was real exciting, and I think that's kind of where I started learning a little bit more about our political stature when I was in high school. And to get to a little bit about Joe Pakootas and where I'm at today and what I'm doing. You know, I received my master's degree from University of Washington in 2006. I went back to school and got my master's in business administration. And part of the reason for that is because of the need for Indian tribes and their businesses to start, I guess, thriving in today's world, today's society. Because when I went back to my reservation, my tribe, our corporation, our businesses were $8.1 million in the red. And they were considering bankruptcy then. And I decided to apply for the job, and a lot of my family and a lot of my friends and some of my mentors was wondering, what the hell are you doing that for? You know, because it's doomed. And understanding the tribal business side of things and being armed with a brand new master's in business administration and understanding the corporate world outside, I thought, you know, I'm going to give this a try. Within 9 months, we were $2.3 million in the black. So we made some drastic turnarounds, and it was real exciting back then because, as you heard, I was on our business council for 16 years and chairman for 5 years. So I understood the political side of things too. So that was the exciting part of. And another thing that's interesting too is when I first took the job over, come back and as CEO, I was the 25th CEO for our corporation. And our corporation had been in operation for 25 years at that point in time. So you see another challenge. The average CEO was 10 months to 1 year for our corporation. I've been there for 4.5 years now. So I think I'm going to be in the Guinness Book of World Records as far as CEOs for Caldwell Tribe is happening. So that's another exciting part of what went on too. I understood Indian politics, I understood Indian business, and I understood the corporate business outside too, so that was a great help for me. So it was pretty exciting to be able to accomplish that and turn things around, because we had 13 businesses, and we were, at that point in time, the largest employer in northeastern Washington, north central Washington, also the Caldwell Tribe was. And at that point in time, we were contributing about $120 million locally to the economies. And, you know, it kind of got me into the realization that we need to start moving forward as far as our businesses and stuff and starting to create new economies in our areas. Because what I want to talk about a little bit now is the contributions of Indian tribes to the economies of Washington State. There's 29 tribes in Washington State. And we didn't really consider this or think about this until Governor Locke, when he was governor, and when I was chairman, I sit down with him and talk to him about building the economies in eastern Washington, because they were pretty slow and they were kind of dying at that point in time too. There wasn't a whole lot going on, because in the past it was agriculture, mining, and manufacturing was our industries in eastern Washington. And those were dying, so we had to figure out something new. So I sit down with Governor Locke, and we considered looking at all of the Indian tribes in Washington State and generating support for the tribes so that we can start creating new industries, start creating new businesses in our areas. So we put together what we call the contributions of Indian tribes in Washington State, and the state of Washington paid for half of that. And what we did is we looked at all tribes in Washington and the contributions that they make to Washington State economies. And knowing that Indian tribes, reservations, do not have economies. All of everything that we contribute to is outside of our reservations. And I'll get to that, and I'll talk to you about some of the numbers and stuff that we come up with. of the 29 tribes in Washington State in 97, they contributed $1.2 billion to the economy in Washington State. That was money that they bring in to their reservations, to their businesses, for that wasn't there in the beginning. Like I said, our tribe at that point in time was contributing $120 million annually is what we were bringing into the region, contributing to our economies. So of that $1.2 billion, we employed about 14,000 people in Washington State. The state taxes was about $5.4 million of taxes that was paid to the state of Washington through property taxes. And 865 million of that 1.2 million was directly to supplies and equipment and everything that we purchased from our vendors. That made a direct impact outside of our reservations that they contributed to the areas that they come from. You know, from Spokane, Colville, every place around our reservation. So we were looking at how we can increase or rebuild some of the industries or increase some of our economies in our local area, because it was basically dying. And as you can see in eastern Washington, there's a lot of that going on today too, that we have to start looking at and start to rebuild and so we were looking at some different numbers and stuff back then. Today, or actually in 2012, they did some updates to those numbers, and that 1.2 billion grew to $2.4 billion in 2012 is the most recent numbers that we have today. That 14,000 employees grew to 27,000 employed. That $5.4 million that was paid in taxes back then for payroll taxes and all that grew to total about $1.3 billion in 2012's dollars. So there's a huge impact that we were able to make and start to restructure a lot of our economies around the reservations. Our reservation, like I said, we brought in 120 million. This next year it's going to be up to 135 million is the growth that we're making for our corporation. So of that $135 million that we bring into the Colville Indian Reservation, not one penny of that, actually I got to clarify that, 99% of that goes away from the reservation. Because we don't have economies on our reservations. We don't have the car lots, we don't have the Walmarts, we don't have the shopping malls and that on our reservation to spend it. So our people, when they receive their payroll and stuff, they go to Colville, they go to Spokane, they go to the outlying areas. That's increasing and building their economies. So that's kind of the advantage, I guess, of Indian tribes and looking at those areas. And remember I said I was going to dispel some stereotypes, some myths. One of the myths is that we always hear from outside people is that we're a drain on the federal government's budget. That we're wards of the government. The government takes care of us medically, educationally, and they are required to do that through treaties. But that hasn't happened. That don't happen too often. But if you look at the contributions that Indian tribes do make to the region, dollars that we bring in, that doesn't help us a whole lot in our areas. It helps outlying areas. You know, people say that we don't pay taxes, and when I was on a business council, I used to go out and talk to high schools and our school students and stuff too about this, that we do pay taxes. We pay more taxes than anybody else in the United States. And our tribal governments council don't like their Indian enrolled members to hear this, because we pay all of the federal taxes, all the employment taxes, just like anybody else does through their employment. You know, the FICA and Social Security and everything else. We pay all of those. We also pay all of the state taxes, just like everybody else does. When we purchase goods and services outside the reservation, we pay all the taxes. We pay property taxes, just like everybody else does in the state of Washington. So we have another tax that our people didn't really consider and that nobody really thinks about, and that's a tribal tax. For our tribal government, it costs $45 million to operate our tribal government annually. Those dollars come from the resources that are owned by every single individual tribal member. And we have 9,500 tribal members. And that's from newborn all the way up to our oldest, which is 103 years old. So we have 9,500 tribal members, so each one of those pays almost $5,000 a year in taxes, in a tribal tax. So we pay an additional tax over and above anybody else in the United States that pays. And our tribal governments don't like our tribal members to hear that, because they're being taxed once again, even that much more. So when you hear that we don't pay taxes, it's just kind of, it's a very, very, I guess, discouraging myth for us. And there's a lot of other myths, a lot of other stereotypes about being drunken Indians and everything else, and we're disproving a lot of that, by looking at the contributions that we make to the United States, to the society. So I'd like to get into a little bit more about Joe Pakootas now, since you kind of understand my ancestral history and where I come from, and the fights, the trials and tribulations that we come through as a government, as a people. And I was witnessed. We went through the relocation, but we come back. And when we come back to a lot of dysfunction on the reservation. There was a lot of alcohol, so there was a lot of drunken Indians back then, back in the early 60s. And when we come back, the first thing that happened to us is the state took over our family, because there was a lot of domestic violence, a lot of alcohol and stuff in our family. So the state come in and removed all 7 of us and brought us to a foster home off, and they would bring them off the reservation back then also. Now they try to place you with another Indian family to maintain those cultures and traditions. But they removed us off the reservation. And they moved us to Chewelah, which is across the river, and that river is pretty wide, so often I thought about swimming across the river back to the reservation, but I didn't know how to swim. But anyway, there was 7 of us, and we went to a foster home, a non-Indian foster home in Chewelah. And that foster home happened to be on a dairy farm. And the owners were Fred and Ethel. Many people, older people, probably know Fred and Ethel from the Lucy show. Their names were Fred and Ethel, and they're just like Fred and Ethel back then too. And they loved having 14 additional hands on the dairy farm. And that was great. It was a great learning experience for me and my brothers and my sister also. So it was pretty exciting back then. But we lived through that. We was there for 3 years, and our family reconciled, and we was able to come back. So things got a lot better for us back then. And prior to graduation from high school, I didn't know a whole lot about my own history, our family history, and I surely didn't know anything about our tribal history and the politics side of things until I was a junior in high school. And remember, I said that our tribe really become politically savvy and saved us from termination and various other things. I didn't know any of that until I was a junior in high school. And when I was junior in high school, our teacher, contemporary world problems teacher, gave each one of us an assignment at the beginning of the year that we could study any government in the world that we wanted to. And all of the students in my class, there were 16 of us, had looked at the government that they wanted, and most of them took like Russia and China and Germany, because you could see those on TV and read about them in the papers and understand them. But me, I took tribal government because I lived on a reservation. I was a tribal member, and that was one of the governments I knew not a thing about. So I took tribal government, and that's when I learned about the political savviness of our tribal leaders in the past. But I did that for a whole quarter. Each one of us, after the quarter is over, we got to get up in front of the class and give our explanation and talk about the government and what happened and the makeup and the Constitution bylaws and all of that. And I actually attended some of our tribal council meetings and some of our committee meetings and some of our general membership meetings to understand what was going on. At the end of the quarter, our instructor, our teacher, he asked each one of them about that government, and then he asked me, he said, well, would you ever consider being a tribal council member on your tribal government. I said, no way in hell would I ever do that. You know, knowing what went on and knowing the fights and things that they had to go through. And then the interesting thing about that is 12 years later, guess where I'm at? I'm on a tribal government, and I loved it. I understood what happened, what went on. I understood our history of our people. Excuse me. And I think that made it a lot easier for me to be there. And I spent 5 years as chairman, as the leader of that group. And I think a lot of that prepared me for where I'm at today. And understanding all of that. So, to get back to a little bit more, and all during my life, I've dealt with young people, coached school kids for 35 years, from second grade to high school, and mentored young people. So I think that's, people ask me why I'm doing this, and it's for them because our future is in jeopardy. I think a lot of people see what's going on in the world today. A lot of people see what's going on around them, especially in the 5th Congressional District, and how things are happening, how things are going. That's just not conducive to our way of life or what we'd like to see. Because I've always been taught that whatever I receive in my life, I need to pass on and leave it in better shape for my children, my grandchildren, than how I received it. And that's my focus on what we're doing and what we're looking at for the future. But knowing what the 5th Congressional District is, now we're going to get into the campaigning side of things a little bit. 1 in 5 people in the 5th Congressional District live on food stamps. That's 20% of our people live on food stamps. A big majority of those 20% are children. Are children that depend upon that food on our tables. A lot of that also is our veterans that depend upon that, because their veterans benefits have been cut so drastically that they depend upon food stamps also for nutritional meals. 1 in 6 of our people in the 5th Congressional District live below the federal poverty level. And that's a reason for the 1 in 5 living on food stamps also. So there's some drastic changes that we need to start considering and start thinking about today to make sure our futures are secured. That's what drives me a lot of. So it's very challenging, but I find it's actually very fun. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. And it's interesting going from tribal politics to basically world politics and seeing how things, there's not a whole lot of difference in dealing with our people and that, but we're just dealing with larger numbers, a lot larger numbers. I know I kind of jumped around, and I don't want to bore everybody with some of the history of stuff that I talked about, but and I'm more than happy to open up for any questions, or if anybody got any questions or concerns or just any advice even. I would love to hear it. And I can keep talking if you want me to, or I would like some general discussion too. Yes?
Can you tell us about the lawsuit that you brought against
Tech Kaminko. Tech Kaminko? Yeah. Okay, and I'm kind of a pseudo-environmentalist also. I guess you might say that. The way I grew up, the Columbia River borders our reservation. And the Columbia River starts up in Canada. And it goes all the way down into the mouth of the Pacific Ocean down by down in Oregon, Portland, and Minnesota in that area. Well, there's been a company, a Canadian company, a slag company up in Canada, just about 8 miles north of the border, the U.S. border, 8 miles north of the Colville Reservation also, that has been dumping hundreds of millions of tons of slag into the Lake Roosevelt for 100 years now, ever since they've been in business. And that slag has mercury, it has lead, it has all the toxic chemicals and minerals in it. And they've been doing this for over 100 years. And we went to EPA to try and get that stopped, to get them to classify it as a Superfund site for cleanup. And they wouldn't do it. You know, EPA is pretty much directed by the administration, presidential administration, and they appoint the directors in that back then. So we went to EPA, and they wouldn't look at it as a Superfund site to file something against a Canadian company. So in order to get anything done, according to CERCLA, which is the rules and regulations that governs the Superfund sites, if the federal government doesn't want to step in, then citizens can bring suit against the company. And that's what we did. Myself, as chairman of the tribe, we couldn't do it as a tribal government, so I stepped out and filed suit against the corporation or the company individually, myself and another one of our community members in Inchalim. So we actually got the dumping stopped. But the most interesting piece of this, I guess, is the battle, and this was in 2004, 2001, I can't remember the exact date, it's been a long time. But the interesting piece of this is the state of Washington had joined us as amicus and helping us out in the fight. But the federal government isn't helping one bit. So they're actually kind of dragging their feet and not pushing the regulations, rules and regulations. So every step of the way, we've won in court every step of the way to get them to stop, and we're trying to get them to actually clean it up. And that's the battle that they're going through. And EPA has been kind of silent and stepped aside, but the United States Chamber of Commerce joined with the Canadian company in fighting this battle that we're into. So that's the real sad part of it is just that. So we're putting up millions and millions of dollars. Well, I'm not, but the tribe is backing me and supporting this. So they're putting up millions and millions of dollars to fight this battle. But we at least got them to stop dumping and contaminating. But we're going to be battling to try to get them to clean it up too, which is going to be a huge battle, because those contaminations have been there for 100 years, and we got some of the most beautiful beaches up around that area. They're black. You know, and when the sun's shining on them, they just glisten. It's just beautiful. But that's that slag and that contamination that's, 6 inches to a foot deep. That's been accumulating there for years, so nobody can use those beaches. There's warnings that you can only eat so much of the fish per month, and there's a whole bunch of various things about that. So that's one of the battles that we did. Is my environmental side of Joe Pakootas. There's a question here, and then you'll be next.
So I've been teaching students at WSU for 27 years the relationship between land and people, natural resource management of people. When I arrived here, I knew nothing about your story. And one of your tribal members took a class from me early in my career. He is now a resource manager for your organization. And I asked him at the end of the semester what he thought about the class. It was natural resource policy. And he said, well, Matt, you did a pretty good job of telling your story, but you didn't tell my story. And it was like he had kicked me in the stomach, politely, but kicked me in the stomach, because as soon as the words came out of his mouth, I knew they were true. And I've spent the last 20 years of my career trying to learn your story, trying to teach natural resource students. And I try to bring tribal members into all of my classes and to sort of tell the story that you're now trying to tell from the political platform. And I've long believed that we needed tribal leaders like yourself to step forward into the political process. And I am absolutely delighted know it's not an easy thing. It's a very uphill battle. And I know your opponent has very little sensitivity to these issues. I happen to know her personally. So I know you have an uphill battle. But I just strongly congratulate you for stepping forward and doing this.
Thank you. There was a lot of... Thank you. There was a lot of arm twisting and... Really, no. Not really. Yes, over here.
Yes, the Graduate Professional Student Association here at WCU has recently created a lobbying arm, and we have some great concerns about a Tax Reform Act for 2014 in the House right now. It's seeking to eliminate lifetime learning credit, eliminate or repeal a tax deduction for interest paid on qualified loans, as well as repeal a tax deduction for tuition waivers. Tuition waivers for a year, about $11,000, that would become taxable income for graduate professional students. I don't want to put you on the spot with how you handle this stuff, but I wanted to bring it to your attention and show you that it's a concern of ours and in this district in particular.
Yeah, it's happening out throughout America, actually. You know, not, and you're noticing it more in the rural districts, than you're going to notice it in some of the urban areas. A lot. You know, I guess the middle class shrinking is what's going on. You know, and you look at, they're talking about a balanced budget, and I've balanced budgets, and I've done that with the tribal government, and I've done that with our corporation. The way to balance your budget is you have to make sure that your revenues don't exceed your spending, and vice versa. That's what a balanced budget is. There's no way that you can balance your budget if you're working off projections, which the federal government does. And today, they're reducing those revenues by giving huge tax breaks to certain individuals. Let's just say the rich people, okay? They're giving those tax breaks to the rich people to the tune of $70, $80 billion per year, you know, in some cases. And what that does is that reduces the amount of revenues that goes into the budget, okay? And where do they balance that loss? On the backs of the middle class people, middle class Americans, okay? The students, the veterans, you know, the people that are out there working on a daily basis. That's where they're balancing. The people that are on food stamps, okay, they're going to reduce the amount of entitlements to those people for food stamps, and even some of our elders, some of our seniors on Social Security. Those are the people that they're going to be balancing the budget on, reducing the amount of benefit that they receive. You know, that's going on. My wife and I, we paid 28%. Our tax rate for last year was 28%. Okay? And Warren Buffett, he has no secrets of telling what his tax rate was, 17%. Okay, he's one of the richest people in the world. And 17% of his income goes to taxes. 28% of my income goes to taxes. There's not a whole lot of fairness there at all. And that's how they balance the budget also, is they reduce the amount of revenues that they're coming in by giving certain benefits, and they're going to reduce the amount of benefits that are putting food on people's tables in some cases, or getting them insurance, health insurance, you know, quality health insurance and that affordable health insurance. That's where they're going to balance the budget. It's sad that happens, but that's reality. That's life as such that we're living into in rural America. Yes?
What changes do you hope to see in the Indian reservation system in Washington State?
Throughout the years that I've been working on is I guess, there is changes now, and I hate to say a whole lot of this because those changes can stop. Because when I went to school at the University of Washington, and I was hoping that I'd get some of my tuition back because I did just as much teaching there as they taught me of Indian country. Because the professors there talked about China, the economies in China and Russia, and you know every place except for the United States. And they didn't even know or consider that there's Indian reservations here. And the interesting thing about that, and we're educating corporations and other people about this, is these big corporations don't have to go offshore anymore to get the huge benefits that they do. You know, the tax breaks, the cheap labor, and all that stuff. They can come to the Indian reservation and do that exact same thing. We've got an example on a Culver Indian Reservation today that we negotiated, and we're working on another example today. If a corporation wants to come and locate on a reservation, if they hire local Indian people, they can get tax credits anywhere from $2,500 to $20,000 per individual per year, depending on their salary structure for that. Okay? If they come onto the reservation on trust property, build a facility there, they can get accelerated depreciation for their box, their building. Okay? Where normally it might be 39 years for depreciation, they can depreciate it in 22 years. So they get their money back a lot quicker. Their businesses, if they got equipment, purchase equipment, we did this with a corporation because they come in and lease one of our mills, and they purchase new equipment to put in there. They can accelerate the depreciation on their equipment, where normally it might be 7 years for depreciation, they can depreciate it in 3 to 4 years. So they get their equipment and everything paid for within 4 years. Plus, if they're leasing tribal property, trust property, they can use that as a tax deduction also. And they're finding that out, and we're just now getting educated ourselves on that, and we're educating corporations. So now they can actually stay right here in the United States, and everything you purchase in the future can be made in America. You know, those are things that we're educating and we're finding out, and that was things that I had kind of worked in with our professors in the University of Washington. And when I graduated, I asked if I could have a refund of some of my money, you know, because I did just as much, like I said, I did just as much education as they did of Indian country, but it didn't work out that way. But anyway, I thought I'd give it a try. But, you know, I think for Indian country, I think that would be it. Looking at that situation, something like that is because we do everything for ourselves. We do everything to better our people, to improve the lives, the quality of our people's lives. But as I said, you know, we don't have any economies on our reservation. So what we do is we improve everything outside of our reservations that much more. In order for us to improve our own lives, we're improving the lives of thousands of people that are, you know, adjoining the reservations and those other businesses. So I think that would be one thing, you know, as far as Indian people or Indian tribes or Indian reservations, is to help us help you, you might say. Yes?
So being optimistic, and I know you don't necessarily have a choice, but when you're elected and you go to Congress, what committee would you want to serve on? Or what committees would be your priority in that respect?
A couple of, you know, because of my expertise or my experience, I guess, would be in the financing side of things. You know, Ways and Means or Finance Committee or Budget Management, whatever committee they call it, I don't know. And also Natural Resources would be an interest of mine. So those two would probably be the top two that I'd be looking at and considering. And, you know, taking a look at any other committee that I may have some expertise in or some knowledge in is where I'd be looking at. I'm not a veteran, so I wouldn't really look at the veteran side of things or that, you know, but I do have my father's a veteran, all my uncles are veterans, and I got tons of veterans in my family, so I may be interested in that aspect also. Yes?
If you were, shall I say, lucky enough to be in a debate with Kathy McMorris-Rogers, what question would you like to be asked to you and to her to sort of, you know?
I don't know, that's I think that was one of the things that they're going to ask or give us a chance at maybe the Walla Walla debate, was each one of us get to ask the other a question. And, you know, that's something I'd be struggling with, because there's thousands of questions I'd like to ask her. Specifically, you know, healthcare, veterans. I mean, there's just a whole host of everything that affects Eastern Washington I'd like to ask her. You know, I'd have to figure out, I guess, one way to ask a long question that would encompass 5 or 6 different topics. But I struggle with that. I don't really know. And I don't know what I'm preparing for anything as far as the debates and stuff. So any real topic, I don't have no favorite or any of that at all. There's like I say, there's way too many. There's way too many that affect people in Eastern Washington.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, yes.
Well, I was just going to bring up a point. As I understand, McMorris Rogers said she was going to debate, and then she backed out of all the debates.
No, she sent an email to my camp and said that she would like to do 3 debates, 2 in Spokane and 1 in Walla Walla. And the first one that they scheduled in Spokane, she did back out of that one. You know, the reason being that she had other commitments. I don't know what other commitments, because if you remember last Thursday, they went on recess up until their recess is going to be until November 12th. So that's another piece of this huge pie, is the lack of commitment from Congress. You know, and Kathy touts herself as being one of the leaders. She's the 5th or the 4th ranking Republican in Congress. Okay, and she's back home. Sometimes she talks about that leadership, you know, but she don't really think about the leadership that she's presenting. Is she's the leader of the most dysfunctional Congress, most ineffective Congress in history today. That's what she can hang her hat on, is that leadership that she's talking about. This Congress recently had a 91%, actually they said 9% approval rating, but I say it's a 91% disapproval rating is what this Congress has today.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.